We need to discuss a question that is deeply uncomfortable, not because it's new, but because it's old, unresolved, and dangerous if handled carelessly. When, if ever, is political violence justified in a domestic context? And I want to be clear about my thesis from the outset. We need an analog to just war theory, a serious discipline framework for answering that question in the context of domestic constitutional collapse. Not to encourage violence, not to legitimize lawlessness, but because if we don't define that framework carefully, history shows it will be defined for us at the worst possible moment. Now, in a slightly different context, this question isn't controversial at all, because between nation states, we already have a framework. For centuries, the Western tradition, through the Catholic Church, through thinkers like Augustine and Aquinas, developed what we now call just war theory. It was a disciplined attempt to answer a difficult problem. If violence cannot always be avoided, under what conditions can it ever be morally justified? Now, again, the purpose was not to encourage war. Far from it. The point was to restrain it. And we still use that framework today. We've been talking about it quite a bit recently in the context of the war in Iran. And just to be clear, because consistency matters, I don't believe the war in Iran satisfies just war theory. Not factually, not legally, and not morally. There was no imminent threat, and without that, the justification collapses. That's an aside, but it matters because it shows we are willing to apply disciplined moral reasoning to the use of force between states. But again, here's the problem. We have no comparable framework for domestic political violence, and we should. Now, I want to posit the following. Within a functional constitutional system, the baseline is relatively clear. Political violence is not justified as long as there is a functioning constitutional framework for resolving domestic conflict. That is the point of a constitutional system of government. We have courts, we have elections, and we have impeachment. Those mechanisms exist specifically to prevent disputes from escalating into violence. But those mechanisms depend on an assumption that the system is actually functioning. And that's where the real philosophical questions begin. This is not a new problem. It's not a new question. In fact, as Americans, we began to answer it 250 years ago. Thomas Jefferson, one of the greatest philosophers of American history, penned the Declaration of Independence. And in it, he wrote, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. And even more importantly, prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government. That is an early attempt to answer the exact question that I am posing. But here's the problem. That standard has not been meaningfully clarified in 250 years. We've inherited the conclusion, but we haven't refined the test. And that matters because the traditions that engage this question, Locke, just war theory, the founders of the United States, do not make the answer easy to articulate. Now, it's clear that they set the threshold extraordinarily high. They require more than disagreement. They require more than misconduct. They require even more than serious abuses of power. They require something closer to systemic failure, a condition where lawful remedies no longer function. Rights are not just violated, but structurally denied, and no peaceful path remains to restoring constitutional order. But that is far from a bright line test, and we need to make it clearer, because the law at its best does not eliminate gray areas. It just disciplines them. It gives us standards, it gives us frameworks, and it gives us a shared language for identifying when a line is being approached or crossed. But very rarely does it lay out where the lines are with anything approaching engineering standards. And as it applies to the question of where and when domestic political violence is justified, right now we are operating almost entirely in an ambiguity. And that creates serious risk. Not just that governments fail, but that individuals acting alone can decide for themselves and maybe even for the rest of us that the system has already failed. There is danger not only in that the system might fail, there is also danger in that people will decide it has failed for the rest of us before it actually has. And we are already seeing the early signs of that strain. When individuals begin to believe that lawful mechanisms no longer work, they start looking outside the system. And we need to be very precise here. People can and often do have real grievances against the government. That has always been true. And history shows us that in moments of perceived breakdown, individuals sometimes convince themselves that extraordinary actions are justified. Recognizing that reality does not require us to endorse those actions, but it does require us to take seriously the conditions that produce those beliefs. Now, I want to be very clear here. In saying that we should come up with a domestic equivalent to the just war theory and all of the attendant questions that go with that analysis, I am forced to admit that I do not have good answers to all of those questions. And honestly, I'm not sure that the law does either. But that is all the more reason to start having the right conversations, not to inspire lawlessness and not to encourage political violence, but because serious constitutional systems need serious theories for what happens when those systems begin to fail. If we are going to answer the question, when, if ever, is political violence justified in a domestic context, we also have to ask, who decides? By what standard? And how do we prevent that standard from being abused? We have a just war theory for violence between nation states. We do not have a refined modern framework for evaluating political violence within a collapsing constitutional order. And after 250 years, we probably should. Because if we don't attempt to define that line carefully, it will not remain undefined. It will simply be drawn by individuals acting alone in moments of fear, anger, and uncertainty. And that is how constitutional systems of government unravel.